Here.
Dr. Marshall, are you on?
Look, we can't hear.
We can't.
All right. Let me do this. There. The Vice Chair, Mr. Perez.
Here.
Dr. Marshall is expected to call in. Mr. Meyer?
Present.
Mrs. Roberts? Here. Dr. Solano?
Here.
Madam Chair?
Here.
You have a quorum.
Great. First, I want to welcome everyone to the Facilities Committee meeting. I want to thank Dr. Genstaff for inviting us to see a different part of our campus. From what we've seen so far, this is a lovely building and certainly worth the hassle of driving a little bit further in. It's great. I also want to thank the members of the committee for coming in. You know, I often complain with staff about being first, but I think that that just means we have very important business to take care of, and we know if we get us first that most people will get here and get us started. I also would like to thank staff for the time that they put into putting together this agenda. We have several items that we want to discuss. It's interesting that as things are changing in the state and around the country, you know, what we do in this committee seems even more important because we have such an important role to play in the economy of our state. And I guess in response to that, you know, you guys are all aware of the governor's press release, and I guess I'm going right into the second item, which is to discuss our response to the governor's Accelerate Florida, extending Florida's economic horizon. The governor has asked the different agencies within the state to do whatever they could do to try to stimulate our economy. That is, you know, what different things can we do to make sure that we get money flowing and make things happen, certainly all in the interest of meeting whatever our long-range goals are, but maybe just pushing them up a little bit closer. If you notice in the documents that were presented, there's some very specific items that talk about our chair and her support of this initiative as well as that of the Commissioner of Education. Well, certainly as a part of PICO and as a part of the Facilities Committee, there are things that we feel that we could recommend that we do as a Board of Governors, or we could recommend to the Board of Governors that we should do as a board to assist with the idea of stimulating the economy and getting the money out into the system as soon as possible. So in response to that, we have several recommendations that we're presenting for discussion purposes that I'd like for us to kind of discuss. I certainly would ask the presidents and the representatives from the universities to please participate in this, because this is something that we think will directly impact how we do business, and we're hoping that it will improve the way we do business. Several of these items were actually presented as a part of our facilities initiative. These are items that we have previously discussed, at least some of them. We want to make sure that maybe now is a time now that we have the support from the state to try to accelerate some of these initiatives and put them and push them forward. But this is, I guess, this part of our agenda is really meant as a discussion. And I ask that, you know, as we go over the items, that we all are candid about whether or not we think this is the best direction for us to follow, and also talk about how quickly we should try to push some of these initiatives and maybe consider whether or not we should even prioritize some of them based on what we think will be most effective. So if I could direct your attention to what is noted as my page 1 behind page 2, excuse me. Well, there's a 2 in the corner and a page 1 in the middle for the draft recommendation for discussion purposes in response to the governor's request that the state do whatever it can to stimulate the economy. So I just want to kind of walk through these, and Chris, you may want to be close by so you can respond to any questions or direct questions that folks may have about these, and you may even want to buttress or add to any comments that I may make to kind of get the discussion started. In fact, what may be easier is if I go ahead and talk about the recommendations, and maybe Chris, you go ahead and give your perspective about why we are recommending that, and then ask for any comments from the presidents or university representatives and or the board. So why don't we start with making funding immediately available for July 1, Chris? Can you talk about why we think this is a good idea?
Yes, and again, some of these recommendations could accelerate the process by maybe only 2 or 3 months, but 2 or 3 months in the construction realm can be very critical. Some could have even longer impact, maybe 6 months to up to a year. So none of these, change the world, but they are very, I believe, conservative recommendations. The first one, just because of mechanics, the way the system works, even though you have an appropriation by the legislature, the funds are not immediately available to the university to immediately enter into contracts July 1. pursuant to the statute, they have to get authorization certifying from Department of Education that the funds and cash are available. So the university has to complete a form certifying that they're ready to commence the project, and the Commissioner of Education has to approve that. Because of mechanics, that doesn't usually happen until late August. So what this is recommend, and the other factor in that is you also have to have release. From the operating budget, we are familiar with release. That's, for example, this year, the governor's held back 4% of the total release. Facilities work similarly. There's an automatic 20% release, but then the remaining 80% has to be asked for individually. Sometimes the process of getting that additional release can add several weeks to the process. So these recommendations, provide for authority within guidelines of having the funds immediately available July 1 and then providing for 100% release. Because with PICO, the funds are there. So we're sort of being constrained to the state agency standard that doesn't seem applicable. And that's about as short of an explanation as I can give on that.
Any comments from members of the committee? And I guess, are there any downsides to this recommendation? I guess, because it sounds like we were just caught up in this because that was just the way the state kind of generally did business for everyone else. Is that what you're suggesting? Right.
We're doing business as the way the state agencies do, where our funding source is quite different. I don't see any downside. There's never been a problem receiving release through the process or receiving the authorization encumbrance. It's just as a matter of the time it takes. So the fact that we're never denied, it's just it's an additional process that to me seems unnecessary.
Any comments from any of the university representatives at all? Yes, no. So hearing no response from the committee or from university representatives, it seems like this may be a positive recommendation for us to move forward. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, go ahead. Our second recommendation is to increase the minor project threshold. Chris, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, thank you. This was in the Facilities Task Force recommendations, and it's a matter of, on our PICO list, the committee has to approve all projects greater than $1 million. And the universities have, for years, said that's too low of a threshold. $1 million just doesn't go as far as it used to. And we have projects such as, even if it's equipment replacement, that if they had if this threshold was at $2 million, they can immediately start spending their infrastructure dollars on some larger projects. And I think this is probably the number one recommendation from the universities.
Any comments from anyone? I see head shaking. And just moving up just to the $2 million mark will make that much of a difference?
It'll be a good difference. Now, I don't know how far you'd want to stretch it. Obviously, the higher it goes, the better it is from our standpoint. 1 to 2 would certainly be helpful.
Okay. Any comments from any folks on the committee?
Madam Chairman,
Yes,
just
ma'am.
for the record, I support this recommendation.
I guess in thinking about this, and I'm sure it's been 1.2 for a long time, can you give me some idea what kind of pushback, if any, we would get from anyone on this issue? I mean, was there someone going to think that's too high because we need more accountability? I guess I need to ask. I want to go into this kind of knowing what kind of pushback we're going to get so we can go ahead and kind of be ready for it. If anybody can give me any direction on that. No? What do you think?
At the most, probably there might be some pushback from legislative staff. The challenge is to make sure that the resources are spent for the same purpose for which they've been allocated. That's really the critical element here. And I think we can demonstrate that the decision is consistent with how the appropriation was made.
Probably if you just looked at
Can you get a microphone in front of you, Doctor?
probably, if in doing the discussion, if we just looked at what the higher education price index change has been, to adjust for inflation, if you will, it would be pretty clear why this needs to happen.
Okay. And it sounds as if, and I guess maybe at the end of this, is it necessary for us to try to prioritize these, we think, so we can kind of know, or are we going to assume that we're going to be fortunate and everything is going to be passed without any trouble?
What I believe the plan would be whatever recommendations are approved, I will draft make the necessary markups to the most of these are statutory changes. Do markup, bring that back to the committee. Then the committee will look at these again as legislative actions and may wish to prioritize them at that time in November.
Great, that makes sense. And the third recommendation is to provide flexibility to reallocate funds. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, and this is one that I think would, the board, currently the process is if a university has a PICO allocation, and I'll use the example from a couple years ago of University of North Florida, with they had an appropriation. It was approved by the legislature for land acquisition. After approval, an opportunity came up to acquire what was termed the AOL building. It's a fully furnished, state-of-the-art, wired building right on the edge of their campus. And they're like, this is too good of an opportunity to pass up. They're like, well, but PICO, you have to wait a year to even get PICO. They're like, that's not going to be soon enough. So what we had to do is go through a process, ask for legislative authority to reappropriate the previous allocation and wait that year. And North Florida had to do some higher financing to make it, to basically hold that building until the PICO funding came through. This would allow, the legislature would grant the Board of Governors the authority within the appropriations to allow something like that to happen without having to wait for legislative session, so that it would be up. The board, recommends everything on the PICO list. So this would give the board more authority to go back and reallocate. And it would certainly be within very narrow constraints. I don't think the board would want to, as a general rule, reallocate. And universities rarely request this. We usually only have one or two a year. But it would provide some good authority, I believe, and flexibility.
Any comments or discussions about this recommendation?
Let me just ask to be clear, what you just said was that the board recommends everything on the list. So I certainly understand if we want to reallocate it in amongst the list. I just want to be clear what we're asking for, because I support the concept. But your example was the AOL building, which likely wasn't on the list. So will our recommendation be clear that they'll be able to reallocate PICO funds for other PICO projects that we would subsequently amend the list to approve if they show up in a deal like that? Or is the recommendation to allow reallocation of PICO funds in and amongst the list, and or, as we discussed at the last meeting, for Cortellis projects, if we decide the universities want to use PICO funds to fund Cortellis projects which may not have otherwise been matched yet?
Well, my sense of what was intended for this would only apply to funds that have already been appropriated by the legislature.
Funds, yes. I'm asking projects. Your example was the AOL building, and if that wasn't on the original PICO list, are we saying we would still be able to reallocate PICO funds that were on the PICO list for something that was not on the original PICO list?
Well, as currently drawn up, my thought is that it would only allow reallocation within the appropriated fund of the university. So you could go from PICO to PICO. I think going from PICO to Cortellis, PICO to some other type, a non-PICO use would certainly not be permitted. I'll have to draft up the statutory language still, but I'm contemplating to keep this a very narrow authority. I'm afraid if we make it too broad, we won't have the legislative support. And the other concept may be viable for discussion, but I would almost say that needs to be a separate issue. That would be my concern.
Just want to be clear, which other concept? Because we talked last month about instilling or finding a way to create the flexibility for universities to go from PICO to Cortellis if they chose to do that and Cortellis wasn't funded. So I want to make sure we have that on the table during this conversation. I think that flexibility is important in these times. But I still want to go back to my original question. I think in your example, and maybe it's just because it was the example that you gave, that said we had PICO funding for a land acquisition. There was a different piece of land that came available that we wanted to buy that likely wasn't on that original list. So is our recommendation to say if it's a similar purchase or acquisition, we could still make it? Or does it have to be we're re-ranking internally the university's PICO?
On that particular example, Governor Pettis, the acquisition of AOL allowed us to reduce other instruction requests that would have otherwise come through the University of North Florida PICO request. So in other words, it was a timely and useful substitution and entirely consistent with PICO. The challenge that we would have if there were, for instance, PICO to Cortellis, is that there could be a range of scenarios that would lead to the PICO list being entirely decimated by just-in-time donations that moved us far away from the purposes of PICO.
So if we're clear, then the recommendation as it's written right now is just that it would give the board some statutory authority to reallocate fixed capital outlay within that PICO to PICO and not PICO to something else.
Okay. And I'm saying I think if we're going to provide this kind of flexibility, if we get one crack at it, we ought to be able, with the board's approval, to go PICO to Cortellis as well if Cortellis isn't funding. And it's not necessarily a just-in-time donor, but rather the loss of a key opportunity for one of our major universities or one of our, all of our universities. We need to build in or at least request the flexibility that with the board's approval, we can go PICO to Cortellis as well.
So we're leading into that whole discussion of whether we should do that. Dr. Matcham?
Yeah, I was going to bring this up under recommendation 4, but when are we going to have this PICO to Cortellis conversation?
Why don't we go ahead and start it now? Just go ahead. we weren't going to right now, but we're going to.
I can wait.
Let's go ahead.
We started it actually last month.
Sure, it's no problem.
And I think I don't understand the Chancellor's comment that by using money for Cortellis projects, we would be subverting the purpose of PICO. There's still higher ed projects. There's still capital projects. There's no reason to think that a Cortellis project is not mission central and just as important to the universities as a PICO is. And we have a perfect storm right now where we have a huge backlog of Cortellis money that's sitting in the bank at many of our institutions and can't be accessed, and at the same time we're getting PICO money. Okay? So we're being forced to wait on a project that has the money in the bank for half of it because of the lack of Cortellis. Now, it shouldn't be just flip a switch, but the Board of Governors could consider an institution's request to insert that Cortellis project into its priorities for PICO funding to allow it to move forward. It could be whatever. You could have whatever bar you want to make that happen. But I think, first of all, I was quite disappointed the legislature didn't fund Cortellis ahead of everything. If they really wanted to stimulate the economy, they were getting $2 for every dollar they put up. That being said, it looks like we are several years away from Cortellis being back online. So this money that all of us have collected could be in the bank for 3 years, at which time, and construction costs are still going up, and these projects are lying fallow. So with an institution making a choice of its own to maybe move down a PICO project, move a Cortellis project up, subject to
scrutiny by and approval of the Board of Governors, I think that's a very good use of the money, and I think it's very much consistent with what the governor's trying to have happen here. So I don't know why, if you don't want to put it in this recommendation, I don't know why you don't put it in another recommendation and put it into the hopper right now.
Any other comments, Dr. Gensha?
Well, this also follows the donor's wishes as well, so that the donor sees some movement with the money that they've given as well. I think it's brings more money to the table overall.
Governor Perez?
Yeah, just adding on to Dr. Manchin, I mean, again, to me, the governor has asked us to make recommendations that will speed up and stimulate, and if we allow universities, again, as I had mentioned and Dr. Manchin mentioned, with the approval of the Board of Governors to move funds from PICO to Cortellis, those PICO dollars become $2 dollars as well. And I think it's imperative that we include that recommendation in our plan. I mean, some of these are mission critical projects, and it could be a couple of years.
Dr. Head?
I think the key thing is to have that review by the Board of Governors. If we go back in the past, in better times, we have seen some Cortellis projects that weren't truly mission critical. And when there's money, that's fine. If it's within a university's mission and people want to spend the money that way, that's fine. I can understand some people being concerned if you have classroom buildings, for instance, that have something else substituted for them. But that's not at all what people are talking about now. And the point is so compelling that you're getting $2 for one state dollar. I mean, the benefit of spending $2 for the single state dollar. And you have projects now that are being funded with Cortellis grant dollars that are truly mission critical. So as long as the institutions and the Board of Governors are reviewing that issue and satisfying themselves and others that we are indeed spending the state dollars on mission critical projects, I would hope that we could come to an agreement with the governor and the legislature on something like this.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I have two questions. Is the assumption that if projects were switched off, the switch off would come from the existing PICO dollars allocated to that university and not from the aggregate pool of PICO dollars that had been aggregated? Is that the assumption?
Yeah, the assumption is that we've already would have approved everything, and something happens and we want to make a change, then in dealing specifically with recommendation number 3, that giving the board some statutory authority to do that.
Okay. And then there's a recommendation number 4 on page 3.
Right.
Is that similar to or different than what's being discussed now?
We kind of got ahead of ourselves. We decided to go ahead and start having a conversation now, so they're all interrelated, yes. I guess my question is, and because I've had some discussion about this before, I thought that the concern from the universities was that if we go down this road, that based upon the history of our legislature, that we would never get the matching funds we were asking for. It's kind of like you guys made it happen before, so you guys make it happen this way. And I think ultimately my concern as a policy maker is I don't want us to do a quick fix that's going to hurt us down the road and we get less money.
That's a good point.
So can we talk about that and give me some feedback
Chairman
about
Parker.
that? I'm sorry.
No, I just wanted to agree with you. It is an issue. All of us understand that we have an opportunity now because of the issues in our state, and the legislature and certainly the governor recognize it and are discussing it and want to help. We want to be part and expect to be a leader in the recovery of this state. But I think we need to be cautious, and the presidents need to help us with that we don't, as the chairman said, do something in this economic time that will be harmful to us when there is more, when the state has recovered. So I think it's something that all of us need to consider, because it all makes sense. Of course, we have the generous donors with money in the bank.
Minimum number of lines.
And they have money in the bank and they're waiting, and I know from being involved in foundation work that some of them get a little impatient. And after 2 or 3 years, they say, wait a minute, nobody wants my money. So it's a delicate issue, and we want to be helpful but not do harm in the future. The presidents want to comment on
Governor Perez?
Just building on Governor Roberts' comments, and I think that's why it's essential that in a recommendation of this nature, we make it clear that it requires approval of the Board of Governors, that it's a rare act, not an everyday act, that the value and import of Cortellis is maintained, but there are some times in this incredibly difficult time we've been having, and will continue to have for the next couple of years, that mission-critical projects just have got to be funded. And I think that's why we create the flexibility with the stopgaps of the board approval and try to then protect the interest, which I think you're valid in raising. But I think if we build enough safeguards in there, we can continue to make the argument that Cortellis is essential for the future. But we've got some fires to put out right now.
May I make a comment, Madam Chair? Okay, thank you. First of all, the concern that I'm hearing from a number of board members and that we've had is essentially you might unintentionally lotteryize PICO. And so that Cortellis as we know it will survive, PICO as we know it will not. And that may be a good thing, but I think it'll present, as Chair Roberts has pointed out, some difficulties. Second of all, there is no bright line yet, and we'd have to do this as a board, as President Hitt and President Machen are suggesting. We'd have to develop a bright line in terms of Cortellis, and that bright line would have to be very understandable to donors, and we can do that, and it's akin to a conversation that we had earlier in a few years ago, which was that the Cortellis should really be leveraged directly against our priorities, our institutional priorities, not against donor interests that may not directly overlap with our strategic plan. So I think that, and this is an opportunity for us to perhaps do that, but it will be a slippery slope, and it's going to be very difficult for a donor to see a bright line between what is our priority and what the gift may be directed to. What is your priority and what the gift is directed to? Your boards can handle that, I believe, but we'd have to work hard together to craft that bright line very quickly.
I wanted to just say that the PICO list and what is approved is very precious to all of us, and we wait for 7 years to get a PICO project done and funded and built and the whole thing. So it really is very important to us. I see this initiative as an exception, something that would have to be carefully thought through with a strong rationale that would go through not only the institution and discussion with the faculty and the board, and then it comes to the Board of Governors, and we'd have to discuss it with our legislators too, along with it. So it's not just a light item, at least I'm not perceiving it as a light item, oh, we'll just flip this one out for this. It's a very serious exception that we're asking for that meets the critical mission of the institution. So I don't think that something like this would come up very often. But I can say that if we can jumpstart some projects that we have some strong funding for, and it does meet the mission, then we should have the ability to take it before you as an exception.
I certainly agree with you that having this ability would be great, but I don't agree with you. It feels like it would happen right away. I don't think it would be an exception. I feel like everybody has a project, and as soon as we do it, it's going to be right up on right up on us to make a decision. It's not the kind of thing. I mean, that's just not how we do business. It's the kind of thing that once we make this, if we go by this, if we go with this and make the recommendation, every university is going to have a project that it wants to do this with. And I think it will just continue. So and I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing. I just kind of taking a little bit of a different position with you on this being exception and not happening very often. I think it will happen every funding cycle. But I'm sorry, Claire.
Governor Parker, one way to perhaps address the concern that if we do it once, the legislature will expect us to do it forever. This board could take the governor's letter asking for a jump start and then put a 3-year time limit and sunset it out, that the recognizing that these are extraordinary times and responding to the governor and legislature's request to jumpstart the economy through construction projects for this 3-year period only, the Board of Governors would entertain these issues, because I agree with you. If you don't, there'll be an emergency or a priority every single day. But if we tie it to the current economic situation and the request from the governor and the legislature with a timeline, I believe that might offer protection.
Dr. Ben?
No, I basically my question has been answered. What I was concerned about, and maybe I ought not say this, but some of our projects have sort of two fires burning at once. One is within the university itself, because we would need a facility. Another would be within the community. Our communities are suffering too, and there are some projects that are off campus that are critical to our institution, but also critical to the community in helping downtowns revitalize or things like that. I was curious about how much that role that plays in defining the nature of the fire or emergency, or does it not count at all?
Well, clearly we want to be very responsive to our community, but again, we could end up, PICO dollars could end up being driven into vital community needs that could have or should have been funded elsewhere. And so that, again, it's a slippery slope.
I think that would be the decision that we would have to make as the board, to be the stopgap for the pressure that the local boards of trustees may get on that kind of issue. But I think that is our stopgap role, is if we feel that would be a misuse, then we simply wouldn't approve that transfer.
Dr. Matson?
I'd like to just put a fork in the conversation about the slippery slope and the only emergency thing. I think this is a good thing. And I think if we can't depend on the Board of Governors to say no, then we got nothing here. But I don't see this as an emergency one time, only when we're in the worst economic condition. This could happen, and I think it should be an option all the time. But I think the concerns the board has should lead it to make whatever decision the board thinks is in the best interest of a system of higher ed. But for an institution to move a PICO building down and put a Cortellis project up requires a significant amount of analysis and courage in some cases. So, I mean, don't worry. This is not a something that we ought to be worried about. As long as the Board of Governors is willing to step up and say no when it feels like it must do that. And then the burden will be on us to prove to you that we need this and we really do think it's something that we want to do. So I guess I just don't want the emergency-only mentality to go forward. I think it's a good idea. I think it actually broadens the base of support for facilities and institutions, which, by the way, is one of the unique positive aspects of higher education in Florida. Most states have nothing even approaching PICO or Cortellis.
Chairman Parker? Yes. I have great confidence in the Board of Governors. I think we have emerged as a board of strength and of clear thinkers, and obviously we are not afraid to take on difficult issues. Some of us can attest to that. And I think if we have the staff recognizes that there will be criteria that are serious criteria that would not be lobbied or we will not be influenced to change, I think this board is up to the task of making difficult decisions. And I think when we do that and show that we are, it's very hard to turn universities down because we love the universities and we want you to succeed. So it's very difficult. But we have to stand up and be prepared to do that, and then put pressure on the trustees to also be strong and say this will never pass the criteria of the Board of Governors. We are going to turn it down to save the embarrassment of the Board of Governors doing it. So I think why it's difficult, this board is a strong board and a good board and is prepared to take on difficult decisions. So With that, I think it's important that we take on responsibility that's to the best interest of the state and to the universities.
I guess I have confidence in the Board of Governors in being able to say yes and no. And the only thing I want to make sure of as a policymaker is that we're all comfortable as we kind of go in this direction that I'll be gone in 3 years from the board, but, that I don't read in the paper that, oh my God, now that we've started funding Cortellis, once again, now, things are better and we're not getting those matching funds. And so I'm comfortable with that part. I'm comfortable with us being able to say yes and no. I just want to make sure that as a policymaker, I'm thinking, globally and making sure I'm not cutting off a funding source to something that I think, that we definitely need both, both resources. So, and let me ask about this then, because Dr. Abel recommended that, well, maybe we have it for, a certain period of time, and saying we're doing it specifically in response to the fact that you failed to fund it previously, and in response to the governor's request for stimulating the economy, let's have a window for when we do it. So what are our thoughts about the window? I mean, do we think that's a good idea or a bad idea? Or, maybe that's one way to make sure we get the money coming back.
It's a good beginning, and if we see it successful, Madam Chairman, the window can be expanded.
I'm just thinking that may be the best way to deal with the issue of we're not looking to treat this as the way that we deal with Cortellis moving forward. This is a temporary stopgap because we have precious projects and dollars just sitting there. Mr. Chancellor, what do you think?
There's a lot that speaks to the novelty of making some changes, but there's a lot that would suggest that our funders are looking for any opportunity to shed exposure and liability, and which we all understand under the circumstances. My concern is if we don't put a limit on it that is very narrow, that as we know it, it'll be gone forever.
Madam Chair, I'm not uncomfortable with saying it's a 3-year look. I would also not be uncomfortable in 3 years if we needed to revisit that issue. But again, I think our statement needs to be loud and clear, which is Cortellis is hugely important. It's so important that some of our universities may be willing to take the dramatic step of moving PICO projects because these projects are mission critical as well. We want to do it during these difficult times, and we'll start out at 3 years. I don't have any objection to that as long as that flexibility is there to recommend extending it again if and when it need be extended again. But I'm not uncomfortable putting a 3-year window in here now to at least give the governor the answer which he's asked, which is how can we accelerate this spending in a better fashion for construction. And one way to accelerate it is to spend $2 dollars instead of $1 dollars.
I would just ask the question following on what's been said is by putting a 3-year cap on it, are you not creating a potentially unintended consequence of saying that there's no need to fund Cortellis for the next 3 years because you've now put a provision in play that allows you to use PICO to meet those needs? So it might be better to actually leave it open-ended than to put a period on it if it leads to that thinking that there is a mechanism, the board has voted that mechanism, it's in place for 3 years, we can go on to the next item.
Well, I don't disagree that is an intuitive remark. I mean, it may be, as we look at this, the answer may be to set the hurdle high for board approval and just make certain that it is an extraordinary remedy for a university instead of an everyday remedy with a reinforcement. At this point, I'm game to try either of those approaches as long as we can get some short-term relief and some flexibility. So, my druthers would be no window, high hurdle, but if we need to create a window to get this through, and if the rest of you feel that it's an important barrier or important message, I wouldn't argue it, but my druthers would be high hurdle, no barrier, no window.
I guess go ahead, Mark.
Well, yeah, in thinking it through in the pros and the cons, certainly we could do a 1 year look at it and then come back and activate a second year of recommendation. Because I do believe the legislative process would lend itself to possibilities of Cortellis match and PICO being merged, not around this board but elsewhere. And so perhaps a one-year opportunity, and then you evaluate that next year and come back and extend it for another year if necessary. And I think that would address your immediate tensions and needs without necessarily throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
So I'm hearing a couple different things. First, as it specifically relates to recommendation 3, because what I'd like to suggest to staff is that we go ahead and move forward with your original concept and a separate item that allows us to move to change around the PICO dollars, giving the board some statutory authority. I think that at least in a separate provision or someplace in this, I don't know if it's within the same statutory recommendation or probably someplace else within the statutes anyway, that you also would suggest the recommendation regarding Cortellis. And I think that let's start, because given we have another opportunity to talk about this and think about this again before we have to actually move forward with it. Let's start with the one-year recommendation, kind of tying it into the response from the governor. Let's see how we feel about that, and then we meet again in November. I think it's when we meet. We still have time to kind of give a chance to look at the proposed legislation. The other thing I want you to do is that we're going to later recommend that we not actually vote on the ordering or prioritizing of the Cortellis list, that we're going to have a committee that's going to work on what we should do about that. So why don't we in that committee also address the proposed statutory language, if you all are comfortable with that. And I think that, refresh your recollection of who's actually on this committee, Chris?
I believe the committee was going to be headed up by Ed Popple at University of Florida, who's their vice president, I believe, for administration and finance. I'm sure we'll have other admin and finance members. We haven't constituted the committee yet, so we'll bring in others besides just the financial types onto the committee.
So what I'd like for you to do is let's go ahead and plan to expand that, and so we have at least a representative from each university participating in the process, and kind of work with that committee regarding the this proposed statutory amendment. And let's plan to, as soon as we have something moving, can we start circulating it so that we have some real thoughts on it by the time we come back together in November and have an opportunity to actually vote on the legislation, or proposed legislation?
Yes, ma'am. I'd be glad to do that.
I'm sorry, Governor Perez?
I just want to make, are you asking for a draft of legislation to just provide a one-year window? Is that what you're asking for, or is it legislation to provide the flexibility? I wasn't quite sure what you've asked for.
Because my directive was for 1 year, with the idea that we will have an opportunity to play with it and deal with it based upon the recommendations from each of the universities on this kind of study that's being led by University of Florida. Actually, let's make it like because how often do the how often does CAFA meet?
I'm going to have to defer to somebody who's actually from CAFA.
If possible, can we have CAFA to address this issue, at least meet on it between now and the next time we meet?
Certainly.
We've heard a couple of different things. We have some to suggest it should be open-ended, some to suggest 3 years, and some to suggest 1 year.
Okay.
If you can have CAFA to address, talk about all three of the recommendations. I originally said 1 year, but I'll pull back on that and not ask that you make it 1 year, 3 are open-ended. You guys have a conversation and make a recommendation to us with the understanding that that's probably the parameters we're working, either 1, 3, or open-ended. Okay? So if you can just kind of work with CAFA to add this to the busy list of things I already have going on, to come back with a recommendation for us on the statutory language regarding the Cortellis.
I'll be glad to do that. And if they don't have a scheduled meeting between now and November, I know they do meet on an ad hoc basis as needed. That group is very, very helpful to the Board of Governors in putting forward any recommendation.
And then the other thing I'd ask, because this is such a heavy legislative issue, if some sort of way between now and the next time we meet, if we can have our lobbyists weigh in on this too, to give us some idea of what they think is going to happen, given the specific direction we take. So if Presidents, if you would talk to your lobbyists about this and kind of have some comments from them too, that'd be very appreciated, very much appreciated. Okay. The next item is recommendation that the multi-year funding.
I'll just speak very briefly to this in the interest of time. This recommendation came out of the 2006 Facilities Task Force. They found that most states do allow multiple year funding. And you can see from our PICO list that we actually plan over a 3-year period. However, there's statutory prohibition that a university cannot commit any funds until the funds have been fully appropriated. We know from history that once the board starts a project, we're going to finish the project. That's our number one priority, is that continuation of projects. And we have it planned, we have it funded, but there's this statutory prohibition. So even if a university has the facility planned, it has the schematics, it's ready to sign a contract, it can't if the money hasn't been fully appropriated. So this would provide some statutory flexibility within some constraints. We wouldn't want to say, well, we put $1 towards it, but I think it says if it goes up to 50, if we have 50% of the funding appropriated, that they could move forward. And the legislature, this would basically be asking the legislature to adopt the board guidelines to say, we're going to finish what we start as our first priority. And that seems to make a lot of common sense.
Any comments from members of the committee? From the presidents or universities? So hearing no comments, I'm assuming that we're comfortable with providing some type of proposed legislation to adopt this particular provision.
Madam Chair, I just wanted to comment that these recommendations were developed as a result of input that I've received from presidents as I've gone around visiting, and the desire to have a more expeditious use of those PICO dollars so that we can hold down costs and stimulate the economy. So I commend the committee for the recommendations and hope that the universities are happy that we're making progress in this direction.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for your guidance on this and the time that you've taken to meet directly with the presidents and the boards. And certainly this is something that has been on that we've had some of these conversations previously, but you're working with the staffs and the presidents and the universities, I'm sure has helped us to accelerate the process, along with the big help we're receiving from the governor's office at this time. So given that, the idea is that this is the start of our conversations. I'm sorry. Well, I figure we've already kind of had the conversation as it relates to the funding of state matching funds, unless there's something else you guys would like to say about that. I just want to make sure we don't forget to include that recommendation because that is the rest of the Cortellis money and other state matching dollars, and they are essential that we highlight them as the best leverage that the state can buy. So I want to make sure we don't leave that off our recommendations. So then, in that which CAF is discussing, then make sure that we honor Governor Perez's thoughts and that we separate the two. Okay. Any other recommendations that any of the members of the committee or any of the presidents or representatives of universities would like to make at this time? And please don't feel that the door is closed. If you come up with something that you think would be a really good idea, I recommend that you actually call me or call the chair or speak with our staff. Particularly since we have a couple of months before we come back together again, that will give us enough time to at least vet the idea. So please, if you come up with something that you think would be brilliant, be sure and share that with us as soon as you come up with it, and we can make sure that it's available for us to consider at our next meeting. Okay. So with that, we look forward to receiving the proposed recommendations to the statutory language at our next meeting. The next item on our agenda actually is item number 3, Chris, regarding the capital outlay legislative budget request.
Thank you. If I may?
Yeah, please.
Yes, this is our initial legislative budget outlay request for fixed capital outlay for including PICO, Cortellis, concurrency, legislative approval to construct and acquire facilities that require plant operation and maintenance. If I may, I'll just go through these quickly and see if there's questions on any portion, and then I'll give it back to you, Madam Chair. If you first go, then the first item is the PICO list. It's found in summary fashion. I'm starting on page 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19. And this is our PICO recommendation by university for the next 3 years. It's prioritized on pages 20, 21, and 22. That's what will be officially submitted as our LBR package. We have found historically that it's helpful to have it grouped by institution as opposed to priority. I'd be glad to address any questions of the process on any particular project. Otherwise, that's the PICO list, the PICO project list.
Any questions? Just want to go ahead.
The next page, 23, that's the sum of digits. That's the formula maintenance funding that comes from PICO. This is from the portion of PICO that's not eligible for bonding, and it's used for maintenance by the state. That's allocated by formula, so it's just there's a lump sum amount of $37.6 million. I'll next go then to Cortellis. This is the 5-year list. This is the 5-year list that includes, on following page 24, attachment 4. This is the combined 5-year priority list. So this includes all PICO projects, all Cortellis projects for the next 5 years. This is part of a legislative budget request, but this list is not funded in whole. This just is, in effect, a list of all projects the university system needs. It's not constrained by funding. Then we've had discussion about Cortellis. That's on page 32 and 33. And as the chair mentioned, I believe the recommendation, these are in priority order now. I think the chair would like us to vote on this as a non-prioritized list because we are still having donations come in. They're eligible through December 31st, and at that point in time, we will establish priorities. And the CAFA committee will assist us. They'll help us in developing a consensus way of prioritizing the Cortellis projects. We haven't had historically a need to prioritize because we got 100% funding. In an era when we may not receive 100%, the priorities become very important. Maybe the next item. The next item is on page 34. These are the appropriate legislative authorization to operate. We know about plant operation and maintenance. This is the prior authority needed so that we next year can ask for plant operation and maintenance for these facilities if they're acquired or constructed. And then the very last attachment is, I believe, on page 40. Oh, actually, excuse me, there's 240 is our debt service for capital improvement fees. So that's the new debt service number. It's gone up. That's an estimate. We have not yet issued the bonds that were approved by the board, but it's going to be approximately $28 million. Last, I did want to highlight, and it's an unnumbered page, behind page 40, the concurrency request. Right now, Concurrency Trust Fund has sufficient cash and budget to sustain us through this current fiscal year, the 08-09 year, based on all information I've received from the universities. I believe in 9-10 we will run short of funding if we don't have some legislative appropriation. We need, by my estimate, based on what's coming down the road, we need $15 million. So I think it's very important that we receive this $15 million from the legislature. It is general revenue. We know times are very difficult, but I would believe this is just as critical as Cortellis, maybe more so, because at the point in time that we can't honor a campus development agreement, development will stop at that university. The local government will not allow development to continue, I believe, and I'm sure there's attorneys who can probably put a more nuance on that. But this is essential, and even though it's a very small item, I did want to highlight that, so thank you. And that's a quick presentation of our budget request.
Are there any questions from the committee or from our university representatives regarding the presentation we just received from Chris? I do have a couple of comments that I know there has been some concerns about some of the proposed allocations as that, we are adopting what we consider a preliminary list, and that, things tend to change between now and the next time we meet. So I just want to, just note that for the record. And then additionally, I think it's understood that in making the recommendation that we approve the 09-2010 fixed capital outlay legislative budget request, that we understand that we're not adopting the particular order of the Cortellis matching grant, that's something that's going to be taken up by this by CAPA, and something we'll come back and address again in October. So with that, I'll entertain a motion if we're prepared to do so for the 09-2010 SUS fixed capital outlay legislative budget request. I got a so moved. Can I get a second?
Second.
All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Great. We'll be presenting this to the full board for consideration during our full board meeting. Thank you very much, Chris. The next item is to approve the Facilities and Real Estate Committee work plan. I think inside your folders, there's actually a one-pager that talks about the different items that we're going to consider on the work plan for the Facilities and Real Estate Committee. I want to, I think that this is great that so often we have things that kind of come at us and we tend to just kind of do what has to be done without stepping back and doing some other things that we should do in order to make the system run better. So I like the idea of holding us to the fire, Madam Chair, and having us to come up with this work plan for each of one of our committees. What I've presented here are just several items that I feel that we need to address as a committee, and kind of given some general timelines as to when the items would be considered and approved by the committee. If you notice, the actual, specific deliverables under each item have not yet been established. I want to at least have the initial conversation with the committee now to get some feel that we are in an agreement on at least the areas that we should cover, and then I'd ask staff to come back with the actual deliverables after we've had this kind of preliminary discussion. And you can see that we kind of started today with our discussion regarding the PICO acceleration, the barriers for policy consideration. As we know, we're going to come back and have further discussion on this in November. And if we're able to stay on schedule, be in a position to actually approve the recommendations based upon PICO acceleration at our November meeting. We have an update to the BOG regulation on design build, which we actually will be doing a notice for today in this particular meeting and move for final approval in November. We're going to, we're noted to approve the LBR amendments and guideline language today at this particular meeting. Update BOG regulation on leasing, update the BOG regulation on master planning, approve new space factors. I noticed on this particular proposal, Chris, that we're set to approve this in November. And let me ask a question. That may be too soon, because I like the idea of at least having a discussion before we actually have an approval. So it may make more sense to push the approval back unless there's some particular deadline we need to follow.
No, I think that's a very good suggestion. I was just trying to make sure that it was on the agenda.
Okay. And then our legislative agenda, that requires approval by November. So we had a lot of those discussions today, so I feel comfortable that we should be in a position to approve that by November.
Madam Chair, can I just make a comment?
Sure.
It would be helpful, I think, the Chancellor and I were just kibitzing here. It would be helpful, I believe, if we could, maybe you could have a phone conversation in October or something with your committee to adopt the work plan and have the stuff filled in. Because what I would really like to do is to get all these work plans approved along with the general calendar for the board and get it in a form that it can be distributed to all of the interested parties as quickly as we possibly can, so that everybody is aware of what our work is going to be going forward.
Okay.
And they have time to prepare.
So in light of that, we'll change the schedule in that I asked if you take a minute to look at the topics that I've suggested that we consider as a committee. That we will look to have a committee meeting in October at some point, with the idea that we will make a final approval with the specific deliverables in November. I think that the other items that we have on our list are the annual bond report, the new BOG regulation on energy saving contracts, which is really big right now based on what we're trying to do to resolve. And I want to also commend the university for several things that you're already doing that we're very impressed with, and we understand that you're doing all you can to save energy on our campuses. The space utilization update, completed project report, gap insurance, builder versus owner at risk insurance. If there are any items that you feel as a board that, as a committee, that we should go ahead and add now, please go ahead and we can add them to the list, and they can go ahead and make them a part of our conversation in October. Otherwise, if you want to think about this for a moment, this is at least our initial concept, and we'll plan to meet in October to finalize the list. If you guys are okay with that. Okay. So instead of review and approve, we'll just say that we are going to review the work plan today with the idea that we will approve it at a committee meeting via telephone at some point in October. With that, Mr. Kinsley, can we go to item number 5, please?
Yes. We're going through the process of updating all board regulations, including all existing board facilities regulations. This is regulation 140055, certification and competitive selection for construction management services and design build services. We have, this is again just a conforming change to the existing regulation. It brings it in conformity with existing law, other board of governors adopted regulations. It's very similar to the policy we adopted for architectural services and straight construction management services back in March. We have provided this information to the universities. I think I've received all favorable comments. I've received a couple of technical wording changes, but since this is just the notice, we'll incorporate those comments in, and I'll be glad to address any questions on this regulation.
Right. So the notice period will start now, and we'll have between now and our meeting in November before we actually submit it for approval. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Are there any other items or issues that members of the committee would like to bring before the body at this time?
Madam Chair, just a
Yes.
comment on this regulation. Now, you see in various bid processes throughout each university, whatever it may be, to a vending contract or something similar to this, students are generally involved in that process. And I think that specifically for this process, it would be very beneficial for a student, especially in a major like mine in construction management, to be a part of a process like this, to give that student real-life experience and to be a part of such a great opportunity in their curriculum or as an extra. I don't know if this is something that we want to think about in putting into the regulation or just an opportunity for the university presidents to be able to talk to their student body presidents or the dean of that college to appoint a student to be a part of that.
It sounds like a great recommendation or suggestion to me. Any comments at all from universities in support? I see heads nodding yes. I don't know if if there's a need to codify that in this particular regulation or not. But if you can at least take the comment, and let's have some further discussion between now and the time we have to approve. And I'd ask if you specifically make some time between now and our November meeting to actually, get with Chris Kinsley and talk to him from your perspective as a person who's very familiar with this area, and see if there's any specific language you recommend that we adopt in support of that.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all very much for your comments and participation this morning. I know there's been some concern expressed that we are not moving things forward fast enough as a facilities committee. And I'd like for you to feel that if you have items or issues that you think we should move forward faster, that you would please bring them to my attention, and I'll make sure that we put them on the agenda. I don't want you to feel that we have issues that will make your life better that are sitting, somewhere in a vacuum stalling. I'd like for you to know that we're interested in doing whatever we can to make sure that we move forward with the building projects that are so vital to the support and growth of our campus. And finally, one thing I want to mention again, Dr. Matchin said that's so important. Sometimes we forget how blessed we are as a system to have something like PICO. We we've had it for so long, and we think that, it's just something that everybody has. But having a dedicated resource to deal with our maintenance and the buildings on our campus is a very special thing that I think that we protect by being very judicious and responsible as we allocate these dollars. With that, I say thank you very much, and this is adjourned. I pass it to Governor Perez.